You already have the dates. You have the satellite plots, the telemetry, the transcripts. You have photographs that officially were never taken, and casualty lists that do not match any declared engagement. I'm in this room because the one thing missing from your file is a version of events you can live with. So here it is, the way you asked for it. My own words. The room is small and overcooled. White panels on the walls, edges scuffed enough to show they have hosted a lot of conversations like this. The table is bolted into the floor. The chairs could move, in theory, but they never do. A recorder sits between us with a steady indicator light that never changes color no matter what I say. I cannot see whoever sits on the other side of the wall, but I hear them now and then. Papers shift. A throat clears. A shoe taps twice and stops. They are the you I am talking to now. Start with Southreach. Someone behind the wall tells me what it is. Southreach looks like what you get when people keep bolting new purposes onto an old mistake. When the transport dropped me there, we came in low over a jagged field of wind-pressed ice. The station sat on a rise, a cluster of rectangles joined by narrow corridors and improvised walkways. The oldest modules were faded yellow research boxes from an earlier treaty era, sunk deep on rusted pylons. Newer military units had been grafted onto them, steel grey blocks with exposed conduits and sensor masts. Around it all, fence posts marched out into the snow in irregular arcs. Warning tape snapped between them whenever the wind picked up. They met us at the hangar lip. Douglas, containment commander. Bond, security. Frey, science liaison. No polished brass on collars, no display medals. Everyone wore the same white and grey cold weather kit, rank indicated only by small patches on the chest. They nodded to my insignia, stripped my sidearm, and walked me through the main connector toward admin. Inside, Southreach felt tighter than the satellite images suggested. Passageways squeezed between bulkheads and storage racks. Cabling sagged overhead in messy runs. Doors carried handwritten labels on tape because the official stencils never kept up with the station's constant repurposing. You could tell what mattered by the locks. Climate labs had simple keypads. Power and communications had reinforced doors with double authentication. Observation suites down a long side corridor had both, plus manual steel bars you could drop by hand. My bunk sat in a logistics annex off the main admin unit. 4 beds, 2 lockers, no privacy screens. I never saw the other 2 assigned occupants. Their gear stayed exactly where someone had laid it out before I arrived. For the first 2 days, they let me live inside my orders. My posting labelled me environmental liaison. Over instant coffee in the mess, the explanation was simple. The detachment needed someone to reconcile environmental reports with supply planning. Fuel storage versus generator output versus station footprint. Waste handling. Air scrubbing capacity. The kind of checklist you hand a mid-grade officer when you want him to keep his head down and keep the numbers straight. That suited me. My career sits on numbers and the quiet, patient shuffling of other people's disasters from one column to another. I can make missing freight reappear on paper and make lost equipment dissolve out of accountability. I can turn hard shortfalls into soft language that calms auditors. A tour in Antarctica with a unit that technically did not exist looked like a clean way to tidy my record before promotion. They did not talk about Polar Containment Detachment Kilo in the open at first. That name sat on a single sheet inside a sealed envelope I signed for and handed back. Around the station, people called it the Watch, or just the Detachment. I learned what we were watching on my 3rd day when Douglas brought me to the observation ridge. We left the station in a tracked carrier. The driver, Keen, handled the machine like it was part of his own skeleton. Bond sat beside him, harness clipped in, rifle resting by his knee. I sat in the back, hood up, hands tucked under my armpits for warmth. No one bothered with small talk. Radio chatter stayed on the level of engine status. minor course corrections, a reminder to check tie-downs on some sensor kit they were ferrying. The ridge was a dark line of rock pushing out of the ice some distance from the station. Far enough to feel separate, close enough to reach on foot if you were desperate. Over the seasons they had cut a ramp into it, steep but serviceable. The carrier's tracks clawed their way up with the grinding shudder. At the crest we dismounted. The air hit hard. The cold down there is one thing, the wind is another. It comes at you sideways, full of fine grit that hunts down every gap in your gear. I pulled my goggles down and followed Bond to the edge. "Look there." He nodded toward the plateau. At first I saw only ice, a long, flat stretch running out to the horizon, broken by low ridges and faint ripples. Then my eyes picked out the details. Parallel trenches carved into the plateau, hundreds of them, shallow and dark, running in lines and curves. Beside them scattered shapes half buried in frost. Helmets, packs, weapon fragments. The arrangement had too much pattern for natural ice. "We call that Field Alpha," Bond told me. "First drop field. There are others farther out." He handed me binoculars. "Watch the open ground near the center." I lifted the optics, clumsy in my thick gloves. Wind scratched snow across the surface. Then the plateau filled up. One moment, emptiness. The next, an entire battalion stood in formation where the trenches ran deepest. Lines of figures in winter kit from another era. Parkers, steel helmets, white-painted rifles. They faced outward in sections, boots planted in snow that barely seemed to give way. Voices carried up to us. Orders in clipped accents. Some with old imperial tones, some with familiar vowels, some from farther east. None of it matched any one doctrine. It sounded like someone had scraped every training film from the late Cold War into one soundtrack. The lines broke into motion. Sections peeled off, weapons at the ready, stepping into drills they had already done more times than any of us would live to count. They advanced toward invisible enemies, firing into air. They dropped behind berms that were only grooves in ice. Men took hits from nothing and folded to the ground, hands clutching ribs or throats. Others hauled invisible casualties to cover that existed only in their choreography. I watched one man sprint forward, throw himself down with his rifle at his shoulder, and then freeze. He lay there, locked in that pose, while his section ran through the next cycle around him. After a breath, he rose, returned to his starting place, and slotted back into formation as if the pause had never happened. How often? I lowered the binoculars. Regular enough to plan around, irregular enough that planning stays interesting. And this has continued since the 80s. I kept watching rows advance and fall. That is what I saw in the history brief. The official story ends with a storm and lost radio contact. Douglas had come up beside us, Parker zipped to his throat, eyes narrowed against the wind. Equipment failure, mechanical problems, no survivors. That version suits a lot of people. Our job deals with the other version. The loops. He gave one slow nod. They showed up in satellite imagery years after the disappearance. At first, the analysts wrote it off as sensor noise. Then someone authorized a low overflight. The first pilot who went through at close altitude came back with footage and a breakdown. After that, they built Southreach, ringed the area with fences, and told everyone to look away. They sent a full battalion, I said, watching those men die along the same grooves again and again. And now their existence is this. "First rule," Bond cut in. "You keep your hands off them." The way he spoke marked it as something he had repeated until it lived in his bones. "Second rule," Douglas added. "You let them run their pattern. No rescues, no interference." That second one sat badly from the start. "Every time someone has tried to pull a piece of them out," Douglas went on, "we paid for it. Early days, a medic team dragged a man clear of the drop field. He was calling for help, so they broke security, grabbed him and hauled him out. Next cycle, he appeared on the ridge road, limping behind their vehicle, waving and shouting their names. Half his kit matched 80's issue. The rest was ours. "And heavier fire?" I asked. "Has anyone tried to erase the field wholesale?" "Once," Bond answered. "Artillery from the far side of the ridgeline. They flattened a drop. For one season the field stayed empty. Command congratulated itself. Next cycle, the battalion came back with dug-in positions and heavier guns. Some of the machine gunners wore gear like ours. They had built their nests in the exact pattern of the shell impacts, with better fields of fire. I watched another section advance toward an objective I could not see and collapse in unison. Bodies settling neatly into grooves worn smooth and dark. "What is the job then?" I asked. "If touching them and trying to help both come back worse?" "We count," Douglas said. "We observe. We measure what shifts and what stays nailed down. We warn anyone who strays too close. We make sure nobody with a flag and a slogan charges in to liberate ghosts." "And my part?" I looked at him. "Where do I fit?" "You keep this place running." He jerked his chin back toward the station. "Power, fuel, food. You make the numbers look sane to the people who sign releases. You sit behind a desk and keep us boring." That was the plan. They took me back to Southreach and fed me through the mess like any other new arrival. I learned who took coffee black and who hoarded sweetener sachets in their pockets. I learned the generator maintenance cycle. I was given a desk in a small office overlooking the loading bay, a terminal, and 3 metal cabinets full of manifests and prior period summaries. Each day fell into a rhythm. Morning brief with department heads, check inbound and outbound cargo, reconcile fuel usage with projected consumption, update inventories, sit through an ops review where Frey talked about boundary conditions and phase stability, with a level of patience that implied contempt for anyone who could not keep up. Listen to Bond walk through patrol routes, perimeter alarms and response drills. Drift back to my office and bend the paperwork just enough that reality fit the forms. Sometimes, when schedules lined up, they sent me to the observation suite instead of the ridge. The suite was a reinforced room with thick glass windows angled toward Field Alpha. Heaters rattled under the benches. Screens showed satellite overlays and magnified live feeds. You could sit there and watch the battalion appear, move, die, and vanish without frostbite. People who had been there a long time avoided looking at the field unless duty required it. They kept their eyes on tablets or forms, glanced up to note some slight change in insignia or spacing, jotted a line, then went back to their work. The loops were an old injury. You checked them the way you check a scar for infection, and then got on with your day. For me, it might have stayed that way. An odd station, a stack of forms, a good story for later. Then a survey tech burst into my office with his parka half-zipped and frost in his hair. "You need to see this." He dropped a drive onto my desk and leaned over while I pulled up the files. The images came from a mapping drone that had flown a sector just beyond the established perimeter that morning. The first frame showed featureless ice and faint contour lines. The second showed marks, trenches, footprints. The pattern looked lighter than the old fields, but familiar. Parallel runs, cross lines where sections had wheeled or pivoted. "That lies outside the mapped drop zones," I said, zooming in, my heartbeat steady, but faster. "How far beyond?" "Past the last sensor stake." The tech's eyes had the wide look people get when reality redraws itself. Fresh, too. Those trenches didn't exist on last week's pass. I pulled the coordinates into a wider map. The new field sat like a bruise just beyond one outer warning arc. New ground. No doctrine yet. "Who knows?" I asked. "Ops. Douglas. They're pulling people into a briefing now. Bond wants you there. Frey too." Of course he did. New anomalies mean new missions. New missions mean changed allocations. That was my territory. I locked my screen, grabbed my notebook, and followed the tech through the corridors toward the operations module. The ops room sat near the station's center. No windows, long table, walls covered in screens showing different views of the plateau. Satellite, thermal overlays, ground-level feeds, a rack of encrypted radios along one wall, cables running into the ceiling. Douglas stood at the head of the table. Bond and Frey flanked him. Section leads for power, medical communications lined the sides. Flynn, the comms corporal, hovered by a console with a headset around his neck. On the main screen, they had blown up an overhead shot of the new field. The pattern looked like a more compact version of Alpha, pulled inward. "You're in," Douglas said, motioning me closer. I took a place beside Flynn. His eyes were dark with tired curiosity. "This," Douglas tapped the screen, "is why your beeper went off. New drop field provisional designation Delta. It appeared during the last cycle, outside our perimeter, outside doctrine." "What are we looking at in detail?" I asked. Frey took over gladly. He never wasted a chance to point at glowing maps. "Footprint analysis shows the same base unit as Alpha," he said, laser pointer circling the formation. "Similar head count, similar spacing. Equipment profile is the interesting part. Some helmets here look like later models. Some weapons have attachments that didn't exist in the 80s. Harnesses and body armor come from different generations." He clicked to a zoom. One soldier's chest filled the screen. Harness straps, webbing, a plate carrier that didn't match the original design. On the shoulder, clear through frost, sat a crest. I knew it. Not from any public registry. From the wax-sealed sheet in my posting envelope. A stylized compass over a frozen star. The emblem of a command that, on paper, had not been stood up yet. "That crest doesn't appear in open charts," I said. Frey's mouth twitched. "Right. So either the anomaly has an excellent sense of humor, or we're looking at a field tangled up with operations that officially haven't happened." Bond made a short, skeptical sound. "Or someone swapped a graphic for fun. Main point is we've got a new field near our doorstep, and we need a response." That word meant different things around the table. For Bond, secure. For Frey, investigate. For me, move heavy objects from stores to people without wrecking the ledger. Douglas lifted a folder. "Hire has authorized deployment of the portable field array," he said. "Frey's wish list. Delta gives us the best window so far. Weather projections show a workable gap over the next 48 hours. We either go now, or we wait for the next clear slot, which could be months away." I flipped through the folder. Photos of kit I'd seen in crates near the power unit. Squat generators on sleds, heavy metal pylons with insulated mounts, coils of thick cable. "You're planning to ring the new field with this," I said, "and see what happens." "Officially," Frey replied, "we stabilize the temporal boundary and sample a cycle inside a controlled structure. Unofficially, we see if we can put a finger on the loop and feel it twitch." I looked back at the map. "What do you need from me?" "Movement," Douglas said. "Load planning, fuel allocation, manifests. Enough lift to move the array, power it, keep a security element on site, and bring everyone back in one piece. I can handle that from here." I slid the folder closer. "I'll assign a convoy officer and—" "No," Bond cut across. "Our convoy officer broke an ankle on the last resupply. The backup's green. I'm not taking a trainee out there with that much hardware. You planned the mission. You ride it." I met his gaze. "I work logistics. I'm not infantry." "That's why I want you along," he said. "You're less likely to chase glory." He wasn't wrong. Men with careers still in play rarely go looking for medals out on open ice. "We aren't going out to fight," Frey reminded us. "We're going out to watch the next cycle and place anchors ahead of the one after that. With proper timing, we can keep everyone outside established tracks. Your job is making sure the right gear sits on the right sled." Douglas watched me. "Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then you go." That was how my quiet desk tour turned into an outbound mission across a plateau carved with other people's last steps. They gave me a day to plan. Back in my office, I spread maps across the desk. Field Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. Old looping zones where the battalion kept replaying its final exercise. The new Delta field lay beyond them, near a shallow depression we had marked as unimportant until that morning. Standard convoy routes threaded the plateau. Paths that kept our vehicles between historical tracks, just far enough from any loop that, in theory, you could sit in a cab and watch a battalion kill itself without drifting into the act. I took one of those routes and bent it toward Delta, keeping our line clear of any trenches on the satellite overlays. I assigned sleds, 2 generator carriers, 1 anchor pylon sled, 1 cable sled, 1 med sled, 1 security carrier, 1 combined command and logistics carrier. Drivers, technicians, medics, security, plus me made a little under 20 people. Too many for comfort, not enough for certainty. That is every mission I've ever seen. Keane came by in the evening to walk the plan. He leaned over the map in his undershirt, skin cracked around his knuckles, eyes red-rimmed. "We haven't run this corridor before," he said, tracing the route. "But the terrain looks flatter than the northern lane. If the weather keeps behaving, it'll be manageable. I want 2 extra mechanics, though. Those pylons look like they'll fight us every meter." "You'll get one," I told him. "We don't have spare bodies sitting in a crate." He grunted. "Then we drive like it's parade and hope the ice plays along." "Have you ever worked near a fresh field?" I asked. He shrugged. "Once, different station, different command. We drove past a set of fresh tracks between cycles. Command treated it like nothing. A month later we got a new rule about distances from unexplained patterns. That's how it goes. If they're sending us now, it means someone up the chain marked the risk box as acceptable." "Acceptable to who?" "That sits higher than us." He looked over the map one more time. "I'll keep you away from the grooves," he said. "That's the best I can offer." The next morning, we loaded. The loading bay was a narrow rectangle with overhead cranes and a heavy door leading to the ramp outside. Carriers lined up like patient animals, sleds hooked behind. Men in cold weather gear moved between them with tool cases and coils of cable. I walked the line with my list. Generator 1, Generator 2, pylon mounts, power distribution panels, sensor crates, ration boxes, medical kit, ammunition for Bond's team, even though the rules said we only fired in direct defense and the loops had never opened on us first. I ticked boxes and circled gaps. One generator lacked a spare starter module. I flagged it and loaded the unit anyway. Full redundancy is a story we tell ourselves. The numbers never quite reach it. Bond's people climbed into their carrier. Frey fussed over the sensor crates, rechecking shock tags and seals. Flynn settled into the command carrier with his comms rack and a coil of cable. I climbed into my seat last, binder of routes and manifests under one arm. Keane caught my eye in the mirror. "You get car sick?" he asked. "Only when it's deserved." He made a short, amused sound. "Hold on anyway. The ice likes to remind you who's boss." The bay door opened onto a world of flat white and grey sky. One by one, we rolled down the ramp, tracks biting into old, packed snow. At the inner perimeter, a security post logged our departure and recorded numbers. The outer perimeter gate farther out was a simple barrier with warning boards and paired remote cameras. It swung open for us and shut behind the last sled. On our right, Field Alpha ran. Even from the moving carrier, I could see lines forming and dissolving. A section took positions along a low ridge that hadn't existed when the original battalion deployed. They used cover we had created with a bulldozer to block a crosswind. One gunner, face in shadow under his helmet, turned his head toward our convoy as if listening for a cue. Keane kept his gaze ahead. "Don't stare too long," he said quietly. "You start thinking you recognize individuals. Start naming them. That never ends well." I looked away and concentrated on what lay in front of us. The plateau stretched ahead, a pale sheet broken by shallow features. Old wind-carved ridges, snow dunes, dark scars where trenches had worn through the top layers. Our route threaded through them, an invisible line in my head. We drove for hours. Inside the carrier, the air was dry and noisy. Suspension groaned and protested. Engine pitch rose and fell as we climbed mild inclines and slid down the other side. Every so often the radio ticked alive. "Convoy, check," Bond's voice clipped. "Report status." "Lead green." "Anchor sled, green." "Power 1, green." We rolled past Bravo and Charlie, their activity flickering at the edges of vision. Bravo's troops clumped around a central zone, as if defending some object built out of repetition. Charlie's ran long, flanking drills that folded back into themselves like a looped line on a map. At the halfway mark, we halted at a designated fallback point. A decommissioned weather tower bolted into exposed rock. Its instruments were long gone. Only a skeletal frame remained, scarred with old slogans scratched into the metal by previous rotations. Some were jokes, some just names and dates. A few names had been carefully scored out. We checked engine temperatures, fuel levels, sled couplings. I walked the line, air burning in my lungs, making sure the crates still sat where I had assigned them. Flynn stood at the base of the tower with his headset, listening to channels only he could hear. "Anything?" I asked. "Routine station traffic," he said. "Support nets, a layer of noise on the old training bands. The loops. There's always chatter there." He fiddled with the dial. "Exercise call signs, contact reports with missing coordinates. Some of it matches archive tapes, some of it doesn't show up in any library. We log it and move on." I thought about asking whether he had ever heard his own voice in that mess, then let the question die. We climbed back into the vehicles and pushed on. The new field showed itself as a smudge on the horizon. At first it looked like a low ridge. Then the shape sharpened into something more intentional. A rise around a central hollow with dark lines cut into it. Trenches and paths. Gear half buried in snow, sticking up like teeth. We halted at the edge of the ground we trusted. From there, Frey used binoculars to match the view against the satellite frames. "Formation's compressed," he murmured. "Interesting." Bond took his turn, then lowered the optics. "Closer than I'd like," he said. "That's what fences are for." Frey pointed downslope. "We set anchors here, here, and so on." He traced a rough circle around the outer edge. "We watch this cycle, then plant anchors during the gaps in the next one. With the timing right, we can keep clear of established tracks." "Distances." Bond looked to me. I checked the map and the GPS overlay on my handheld. "If we put the ring where he wants it, we sit just outside the densest tracks," I said. "There are a few scattered footprints cutting across that line, but nothing like Alpha's main trenches. We can shift each anchor a few meters either way to avoid the worst of it." "Then that's what we do." Bond's hood flapped in the wind. The skin on his face looked raw. "Everyone stays outside the paths. Nobody puts a boot into a groove. Anything on the ground that isn't ours stays untouched." We brought the convoy forward in stages, carriers fanning out into positions that matched Frey's circle. Generators went to opposite points, anchors distributed along the arc. Technicians dropped from sleds, tools clanking, breath smoking in the air as they hauled equipment. Up close, the ice told its own layered story. Old tracks pressed faint lines into it, softened by time. New trenches cut clean channels, edges sharp. In some places, newer cuts crossed older, leaving a cross-hatched mess of history. "We're placing these too far out," one tech complained, eyeing the distance to the nearest visible trench. "We're wasting field strength." "You'll place them where they belong," Bond answered. "If you feel tempted to stand in those grooves for a stronger reading, save the impulse for your off time." Frey crouched by the first anchor spot, sweeping a sensor over the surface. "The field's thicker, closer to the visible tracks," he muttered, half to himself. "Expected. The gain from stepping inward doesn't match the cost in bodies. I'll adjust for it in the equations." They drilled mounting holes, dropped pylons into place and bolted them down. Cables snaked back to the generators. Everything took twice as long in that cold. Gloves turned simple tasks into clumsy grappling. Tools slipped. Fingers went numb. While they worked, one of the older fields ran in the distance. The ghost battalion there moved in its own loop beyond Delta's curve. The wind carried fragments of sound. Shouts, the flat crack of blanks, the clatter of gear. One of the younger security troopers drifted closer than he should while watching. A figure in the older field collapsed in a way that looked too much like a real wound. The trooper took 2 reflex steps toward him. Bond caught his harness and hauled him back. "You see what happens," Bond told him, steering him toward the ring. "You don't step in. That battalion has carried its own dead longer than we've been alive. They don't get a rescue from you." The trooper's hands shook around his rifle. I turned back to our work. We set the last anchor near the southern quadrant. I wrote down its position as I went. Pylon 6, estimated distance from Delta's center, offset from the nearest trench by a safe margin. My handwriting ran stiff and uneven. Cold does that. That was the excuse I used. By the time the ring lay in place, the light had shifted. The horizon took on a faint color. Shadows stretched. The wind rose and fell in gusts. Frey checked his instruments. "We're inside the window," he called. "Next cycle should start within half an hour." "Everyone stays on the ring," Bond reminded the group. "You keep clear of the tracks. You hold your position when the cycle hits, unless your lead gives you a direct order to move." "Convoy?" I asked on the radio. "Lead is parked and braked," Keen answered. "All sleds anchored. Engines on standby. We can roll in under a minute." We gathered near the command carrier and watched the field. Delta lay still. Trenches and scattered gear made it look like a training range between exercises. Nothing moved. I checked my watch, then the sky. "We may have mistimed the interval," Frey muttered. "Last satellite pass might have caught the tail of the previous cycle, not the start." "So?" Bond asked. "So this run may start early." He turned out to be right, just not in the way he meant. Most cycles begin with a snap from empty ground to full formation. Delta started with 1 man. He staggered up out of the central depression, legs loose, snow sprayed from his boots. His rifle hung crooked across his chest. His gear was a composite, old white parka, newer helmet, harness straps that matched neither. He lurched 3 or 4 steps and dropped to his knees just inside our ring. Everyone froze. One gloved hand stretched ahead. It dragged something with it, a folded sheet of paper, edges stiff from the cold. He stopped near my boots. I looked down. Frost fogged the visor of his helmet. Through a crack I saw part of a face. Eyes wide, mouth shaped around a sound we couldn't hear. Ice buildup had warped the skin into odd ridges. The paper lay between his fingers and my toes. "Leave him," Frey said quickly. "Keep your distance." "I know the rules." I kept my hands still. Bond moved closer, rifle angled just off the body. "The cycle's half-formed," Frey said. "We're looking at a boundary event. If we can get the sample inside the ring before the rest of it resolves, we might see something we can actually measure." "You want to drag part of it into our circle," Bond said, "after all the warnings we've had." "Protocol grew out of full cycle contact," Frey replied. "This is new behavior. New behavior is a chance. If the array interacts with this fragment while it's here, we may get something different from another looped drill. Leaving him there wastes that chance." "That call comes from command." Bond's voice went hard. "Not from you." They both looked at me. The paper stirred in the wind. Through the break in the visor, the dead man's eyes faced my direction. I crouched, hand hovering above the ice. The sheet had a header, my department code. Under that, a reference string formatted like our manifests. The layout, the font, the watermark pattern in the paper stock all belonged to forms that hadn't yet come off our printers. "Clark." Bond's tone tightened. "Back away from that." "If that page carries command codes," Frey cut in, "we need it, and we need him under the array. This is the first time one of them has stepped out of step in our direction. Throwing that away would be negligence." My hand hung over the paper. The rule wanted one thing from me. Habit, command pressure, phrase hunger, and my own instinct to collect anything that looked like documentation, all pulled the other way. I picked it up. Nothing flashed. No noise. The glove kept my fingers from the cold. The paper felt brittle and too rigid. "Get a sled," I told one of the nearby techs. "We'll move him into the shelter." Bond swore under his breath. "You just undercut both rules." "Those rules deal with direct contact inside a running pattern," I said. "He's early. He fell on our side of the ring. I can justify this as recovering salvage." I dressed it in procedure as I spoke because that is how I live with choices I don't want to name. The techs brought a low sled, slid straps under the harness, and hauled the body aboard. Limbs moved with a strange mix of looseness and stiffness, like a mannequin built out of joints from 3 different designs. They dragged him to a small field shelter near one anchor. Frey followed, eyes fixed on the corpse. Bond shadowed them with his rifle. I unfolded the paper. Movement order. My office header. My signature line. A route diagram from South Reach to Delta, with waypoints that matched our convoy. The date sat a handful of cycles ahead of the present. The section for expected casualties listed names and roles. Some were familiar, some not. Keane, Flynn, a line for an unidentified staff liaison. That would be me. The page trembled slightly in my hand. I blame the wind when I can. "This shouldn't exist," I said. Frey studied it. "On the contrary," he murmured. "This lines up with everything else." Before I could argue, the world gave a small jerk. The air felt charged. The hairs on my arms rose. Under my boots, the ice seemed to shift by a fraction of a millimeter. All of us turned toward the center of Delta. The battalion arrived. It didn't come in with the usual clean snap. Rows of men bled into sight in overlapping layers. A line in 80s kit stood inside a line in newer armor, their bodies intersected. For a few heartbeats, there were 2 battalions trying to occupy the same coordinates. Voices crashed into each other. Training commands overlapped with raw shouts. Rifles jerked. Some men fired. Others cringed from rounds that never touched them. Then the older layer took the foreground. One set of men sharpened, the other thinned until only details clung on. An old parka over new plates, a modern helmet on a man carrying an obsolete rifle. Frey stared through his goggles. "The boundary failed," he whispered. "We're watching layers fighting over priority." "Bring the generators up," I called. "Now!" Techs sprinted for the generator sleds. Switches snapped. Engines thundered. Cables twitched as power flowed into the anchors. Pylons around the ring began to hum. A faint haze rose from them, visible even in that air. If you stared, you could see a subtle distortion forming around Delta's perimeter, as if the light bent just a little. "Field's at 60%, a tech said, checking his handheld. "Southern quadrant's weaker. Some anchors aren't coupling." "Push output on generator 2, Frey ordered. "Compensate." "Leave enough fuel to get us home," I warned. "I'm not freezing out here, so your spreadsheet feels balanced," he said. "Focus." Bond raised his voice. "Everyone stays on the line. You hold position. No one heads into the field." Inside the ring, the battalion started to move. Their routes looked wrong. In the older fields, they always marched along fixed paths. Here, some sections stepped sideways to avoid things that hadn't yet appeared. Others hesitated, looking toward our ring before forcing themselves onward. An officer near the center wore my rank. His harness bore a unit tab I didn't recognize. He raised binoculars in our direction. For a moment, our eyes lined up across the distance. He turned, slipped on a patch beside a shallow depression, and hit the ice on his side. The fall matched one I had almost taken earlier that day when I jumped down from a sled and caught my boot on a lip. "Field reads 80%, the tech said. "We've locked a wedge." "What wedge?" I asked. He held out his display. "The ring isn't closing evenly. Northeast anchors hold. The rest of the field is still running." It's like we pinned one slice of the loop and left the rest free. On the ground, the effect was obvious. Near one anchor, a cluster of soldiers froze mid-stride. Each body held an impossible position. One man's foot hung in the air above bare ice, no support under it. Another leaned into a turn with his center of gravity nowhere near his base. They hung there. Outside that arc, the battalion kept moving. Sections advanced, used the frozen men as cover, then moved on. The boundary between pinned and running sectors showed as a jagged edge. The men in the field reacted before Frey did. Their routes began to bend. In earlier cycles they had moved as if we didn't exist. Observers had watched them ignore vehicles, personnel, even flares. Now, when they approached the frozen wedge, some units altered course to avoid it and the nearby anchors. Those new paths curved toward our vehicles. Bond saw it when I did. "Convoy, start engines," he ordered over the net. "Drivers in seats. Non-essential personnel get ready to board. Move on my command." Keen's acknowledgement came back tight but steady. "Lead turning over." I turned in a slow circle, taking in positions. The ring held, uneven. Generators stood on sleds at opposite points. The command carrier sat a little uphill, fat and obvious. The med sled tucked in behind it. Bond's security carrier held the northern flank. Inside the field, columns of soldiers skirted the frozen wedge and fanned outward. Their projected paths crossed the corridors we needed to use if we stayed with the planned extraction. "Drop output on the northeast anchors," I told Frey. "We need room to move." "We're finally getting a response," he protested. "You want me to throw that away?" Shouts from the southern anchor cut across us. One of the technicians had run a cable too close to a faint line of footprints while the cycle was spinning up. He stood there now with his ankle in that groove as a squad turned toward him. "Move!" Bond said. The tech tried. His boot stuck. The ice around it had seized somehow. He pitched forward, landing on his knees. The squad reached him. They didn't pass through like smoke. For a second, their bodies and his occupied the same space in ways my eyes didn't like. His limbs jerked in angles that belonged in diagrams, not flesh. His torso twisted, as if 3 different versions of him tried to face 3 different directions. His arms stretched and blurred, reaching into spaces that didn't exist. He flew sideways, hit the ice 10 meters away, and stayed there. When we reached him, his legs pointed in directions joints never allow. His spine kinked mid-length. His eyes stared at something tilted slightly away from the world, as if whatever he saw didn't quite share our angle. One of the medics knelt, checked for a pulse, then looked back at Bond and shook his head. The squad that had gone through him kept moving. One of the soldiers carried a fresh tear in his sleeve where the tech's shoulder had intersected. "Field's at 70% and unstable," the generator tech reported. "We're getting feedback from the moving units. They're adjusting to us." Nobody needed his numbers to see it. Each time a soldier hit the edge between pinned and free sectors, his body flickered. Some bounced away and chose a different route. Others forced through, shedding pieces of old kit and picking up newer gear as they crossed. One man's rifle shifted from an ancient pattern to a modern bullpup between steps. Another's helmet went from steel to composite as his foot left one segment and entered the next. "Convoy, move to fallback point Bravo," I ordered. "Use the planned extraction route and push speed. We're done here." "Their paths are crossing our lanes," Keen said. "Those columns are walking right where we were supposed to drive." "Then we move before they finish turning." I looked at Bond. "We either leave now or we sit in this circle until it eats us." He nodded once. "Go." Engines roared as drivers dropped out of idle. Tracks chewed into the ice. The first vehicles swung to turn, sleds lurching. The battalion adjusted again. A column near the eastern anchor broke formation in a way that didn't match any previous run. Instead of following its old trench, it cut across our intended path to a shallow rise. "Path blocked," Keen reported. "They're sitting exactly in the corridor we need." "Hold your line," Bond's voice stayed firm. "They have never hit us." He was already wrong. As the column moved, one soldier turned his head. His eyes tracked our lead carrier. He lifted his rifle, not to shoot, but as if marking our route. He stepped into the track we planned to cut. He never fired. The effect played out in movement instead. Men around him spread into a cordon along the doctrinal escape lane. That corridor had become a choke point. "Clark," Keane said, "I need a new path." I looked from map to field to moving bodies. Options disappeared in real time, each safe line filled with marching men. The only open ways led toward the older fields, where we had no array and no plan. The decision that ended up attached to my name came out of the same habit that has carried me through inventories and shortages for years. "Drop the rear sled," I said. Silence. "Say again?" Keane asked. "Uncouple the last sled," I repeated. We swing the main body uphill along that shallow ridge, scraping the outer edge of the new pattern. The rear carrier holds position as a decoy while we abandon the last sled. We sacrifice hardware instead of everyone. Bond looked from the moving columns to the line of vehicles. "That sled holds half our anchors," he said. "And if we leave it inside this pattern," Frey cut in, "the field adds them to its vocabulary." "You want to argue this on theory," I said, "or do you want any of us alive to write it down?" Bond keyed his radio. "Rear carrier, detach sled and hold position," he ordered. "Your job is to look like the whole convoy as long as possible. Everyone else, follow lead." A pause. Then the rear driver acknowledged. You can always hear resignation, even through a good headset. At the tail, men dropped from the carrier, disconnected the tow, and shoved the sled into a position that made it as visible as possible. They climbed back into their cab, engines idled, then settled. Their task was to sit and be obvious. Keane pushed the lead carrier up onto a shallow ridge. Tracks bit, slipped, then found purchase. The sled behind us fishtailed and almost folded the connection. He corrected with a grunt. "Hold on," he said. We slid over the crest and dropped down the far side, biting into less tracked snow and cutting a route I'd sketched only as a contingency. Behind us, the security carrier followed, then the med sled, then the generator units. As we moved, cables tore free from pylons. Some yanked out of their mounts, others snapped. The battalion swarmed toward the abandoned sled. Columns turned and moved as if someone had drawn arrows on the ice. Through the rear port, I saw the mass around the tail. Soldiers took up firing positions as if our sacrifice were now an objective. Others used the sled as cover, pointing weapons along the vectors we had just abandoned. As we crested the last rise before our chosen fallback path, I caught a final glimpse of the rear carrier. Dark silhouettes stood near it. For a fraction of a second, I couldn't tell if they belonged to our crew or to the loop. Then we dropped out of sight. "Field's degrading," the generator tech called. "We've lost lock in the wedge. Anchors are failing." "Let it go," Bond said. We ran. The route back to the weather tower felt longer and steeper. Snow clouds from our tracks cut visibility. The terrain looked slightly wrong, as though the ice had settled differently since morning. Twice Keane swerved to dodge fresh grooves that hadn't existed on the outward run. Once we passed a stretch where boot prints ran parallel to our tracks. Some sets looked softened by time, others looked crisp. None were ours. By the time we pulled up at the tower again, my hands ached from gripping the seat frame. The convoy halted in a crooked line. Engines idled. No one unclipped harnesses immediately. People just sat, breathing. We did the head count. One vehicle and its crew were missing, the rear carrier. The dead technician's body was still on the field. One anchor sled abandoned. One corpse inside a shelter that now sat as part of Delta. "Do we go back for them?" Flynn asked. "We don't drive into an active cycle," Bond answered. "We hold here and wait for satellite eyes." His tone left no room for argument. We waited. Imagery eventually flowed in. Delta ran again. In the new frames, the battalion moved through its grooves. Near the southern edge, something lay half embedded in snow where the technician had fallen. It no longer matched a human outline cleanly. Near the sled's last position, trenches had appeared in the shape of a vehicle and its load. Figures used those shapes as cover. "Pull back to South Reach," Douglas ordered over the net once he had the summary. "We'll sort it there." We rolled home. South Reach looked smaller on return. Fewer lights. Fence lines felt closer. The loading bay swallowed carriers one by one. Mechanics and medics swarmed. Someone grabbed my arm and steered me toward medical, then reconsidered and pointed me at a conference room instead. The debrief started before the cold left my bones. Douglas sat at the head of the table again. Bond opposite him. Frey farther down, surrounded by drives and slates. At the far end, a new man in darker uniform. No visible rank, just a badge that said he worked for people who prefer glass between themselves and the world. "I am told," the new man began, "that this mission achieved partial containment and produced valuable data, alongside losses and protocol violations. I'd like to hear how you see it." We gave them the bare sequence first. Positions, movements, the early arrival, the partial ring, the technician's death, the abandoned sled. Someone brought in the folded order sheet from the body. It sat in a clear bag on the table. "You recognize this?" the liaison asked. "It carries my department code," I said. "Layout matches our forms. The date and some header elements don't. You understand the implications." "I see two options," I said. "Either the anomaly throws back a version of our future paperwork, or someone staged a very elaborate fake for an audience of a few specialists." He nodded, as if ticking a box. "We'll need a complete after-action report," he said. "Detailed. Logistics will frame the primary narrative." "My job is movement and supply," I pointed out. "Ops and science should lead narrative." "Their material goes into annexes," he replied. "Command wants someone who speaks both doctrine and numbers to structure the main piece. That's you." "It reads better," Frey murmured, "if the officer who ordered the abandonment writes it himself." I let that land and stay. The debrief lasted for hours. They went over every step, every call. When we reached the part where I picked up the paper and authorized bringing the body inside the shelter, Bond went through his anger again. "You bent the rules," he said. "You dragged that thing into our circle. We can't even guess how many changes trace back to that." "If we'd left him," Frey countered, "we'd still have nothing but old loops. We needed that contact." You can read a lot in which fights men choose. Frey fights for data, Bond fights for protocol. I sat between them because, in my own accounting, they were both right in different columns. After they finished peeling that day apart, they let me leave long enough to shower. The water barely pushed into lukewarm. My hands shook while I pulled on fresh clothes. That could have been adrenaline, fatigue, or the first twist of understanding that the mission had bent more than the field. When I reached my office, the order sheet waited on my desk, out of its bag, corners held down by weights. Either someone wanted to remind me of my new task, or the station had already decided ownership and sent it back to the code on the header. I sat and read it again. Movement order. Authorization to deploy the portable array to Field Delta. Route plan matching ours, with a few distance figures shifted. A note about modified anchor spacing. A line on expected field behavior that mirrored the wedge we'd seen. My signature line at the bottom, blank. The date sat a little way in the future by the station calendar, only a few cycles ahead. I left the sheet there and went looking for other ghosts. The secure store for mission reports lay behind a door that needed both card and code. I had the card. The liaison had given me the code under the label Necessary Access for Reporting. What it meant was that I could read the written record of every attempt to do more than watch that battalion die. The room was small, shelves on 3 walls, boxes and binders labelled in a tight hand. On the top shelf, grey folders with red stripes. Containment incidents, block letters. I pulled the earliest one. Inside, reports from first probes near the fields, patrols taking careful steps, drone tests, one infamous mission where they used remote explosives during a cycle. The main report on that one came from an officer with my job, logistics liaison, environmental coordinator. His language felt familiar, cautious, tied to figures. He laid out routes, distances, timings. He described how a remote charge had detonated in step with a cycle, and how next season the battalion's layout had changed to use the cratered ground as cover. He also noted that some distances had been adjusted in the report to avoid blame for failing to stay inside authorized corridors. I pulled satellite imagery from that period. The new trenches in Field Bravo reflected his reported distances, not the actual terrain. I checked another mission. Different officer, same pattern. Small errors in the record matched small shifts in later loops. By the third folder, the conclusion formed. The anomaly didn't just echo actions on the ice, it absorbed the paperwork wrapped around them. The battalion's future routes didn't match ground truth. They matched what had been written down and blessed as official. That piece is the one you came here for. You'll hide it inside theory and stamps, but it's the anchor for everything else. Our reports feed the loops. Once that's settled, the next question was simple and ugly. What did I write next? They handed me a template. Standard after-action layout. Objectives, execution, results, lessons. A schedule in my inbox gave me a deadline measured in days, not weeks. Command wanted something they could point to, while the politics still flowed their way. I stared at the cursor and started with the obvious. I wrote what had happened: outbound route, anchor deployment, early arrival, partial activation of the array and the wedge, the technician's death, the abandoned rear sled, the retreat. I wrote about the body and the paper. I described the way the battalion had bent its routes toward us, blocking corridors doctrine said were clear. Then I stopped. If I turned that in unchanged, Command would treat it as proof that the array worked and that the anomaly could be pushed. They would pour more weight into Frey's program. They would send bigger teams with more hardware. Each mission would generate reports, and those reports would sink into the pattern. The battalion would collect tactics and cover from our words. The order sheet on my desk had already shown one version of that future. My later signature authorizing a very similar deployment. Casualty lists that matched what we had experienced, names off by a few line items. What I did next wasn't heroism. It was habit scaled up. I have always shaved numbers to protect people and missions, smoothed fuel totals, adjusted headcounts, nudged distances to fit whatever story the day required. Those little lies had never walked in front of a camera before. This was the same reflex aimed at something larger. I ran a test. I went back to the draft and changed a small thing. A distance between two northeast anchors. On the ice, they had stood about 50 meters apart. On paper, I wrote 70. I sent that section to Frey and Bond for review under the excuse of checking terms. Frey corrected one phrase about field density. Bond added a note about the dead technician's violation of safety margins. Neither touched the separation figure. We passed that piece upward as part of an interim brief. A few days later, new imagery came in. On the latest cycle, a column moving through the northeast corridor spread out more than before. Where they had once hugged a tight track, they now marched along a wider front. The distance between the outermost lines matched my reported anchor spacing more closely than our actual placement. You can argue margins and coincidence forever if you want to stay comfortable. I didn't. I took it as confirmation. The loops read the reports. They took routes from our descriptions and even from our mistakes. After that, I stopped thinking in terms of test and started thinking in terms of damage control. I didn't wreck the whole report. That would only have triggered higher scrutiny, followed by someone else rewriting it to match their own needs. I needed my version to pass through intact, with its errors buried. So I told the truth about most of it. I kept the early arrival accurate. I kept the technician's death precise. I didn't dodge responsibility for bringing the body into the shelter or ordering the sled sacrificed. I leaned into those parts. I framed them as my failures, emphasized how they broke protocol and increased risk. That satisfied Bond's sense of order and gave the liaison a name to hang blame on. Owning those calls bought me maneuver elsewhere. Where I lied was inside the details that shape future planning. I steepened the reported gradient around the southern quadrant. I nudged each anchor coordinate a few meters off reality. I shifted the recorded time between generator activation and field lock. I wrote the cycle's onset as starting slightly later relative to our readiness than it actually had. None of these changes were large. Each sat inside the range of ordinary human error. A tired staff officer skimming the report would shrug at them. A doctrine writer would carry them forward. I sent the full draft on time. The liaison came by with the printout, finger-tracking lines, lips moving slightly as he read. "You present the array as partially successful," he said. "You focus on the wedge lock." "That's the only moment that looked like control," I answered. "You also accept personal responsibility for the protocol breaches." "I authorized them." He watched me for a moment. "Command appreciates officers who own their mistakes." That was as close to praise as he ever came. He returned the report with small language edits. None of them touched the numbers. The final version went into the system, acquired codes, and began climbing. After that, what remained was waiting and watching. Your logs will give you exact dates. My memory gives you the sequence of how it felt. 3 cycles later, sitting in the observation suite with Flynn, I watched Delta on the secondary screen. The battalion moved through its pattern. In the northeast, the same corridor where I had widened anchor spacing on paper, the troops now marched with that wider spread. Their tracks matched the reported distance, not the one we had actually used. "You see that?" I asked. "They're stretched," Flynn said. "Odd spacing. Maybe new kit." He took a sip of coffee and wrote a note. I didn't explain. Other shifts followed. In the southern quadrant, soldiers stumbled as if crossing a slope that only existed in the report. Near the wedge, new paths bent along the lines of my misplotted ring. At the same time, other figures appeared that had nothing to do with my particular edits. New shapes moved at the fringes of the fields, men in gear that matched current issue. Some dragged cables, others hauled devices that looked like expanded versions of our array. Their routes didn't match any mission we had logged yet. I pulled run sequences and compared them to the archive. No equivalent appeared in older cycles. Those new silhouettes belonged to actions that still sat in someone's planning folder. Late one shift, alone in the suite, I watched a cycle at Delta without taking notes. Past the main battalion and its overlays, a small group walked behind a sled that looked like our generator units with extra modules bolted on. Their body language, spacing, and way of checking arcs said, "Southreach." At their head, a man moved with his shoulders slightly hunched, the way mine go when I'm tired and thinking about figures instead of footprints. He glanced back as if checking a rear sector. For that second, I could almost believe my own face sat behind his goggles. Then the loop reset and wiped him. Soon after, the liaison visited again. "Your report landed," he said. "Command finds it informative. They're expanding the array program. More hardware is coming. Additional personnel will arrive next season." "Frey will like that," I said. "For you, duties change. Your field judgment has been marked as questionable. Your analysis is respected. You won't deploy again. You'll head a small cell here for pattern analysis and doctrine integration." "So I'm chained to screens," I said. "You'll have full access to feeds, history and draft doctrine from multiple commands. You'll help keep our written understanding aligned with observed behavior." That last line would be funnier if it weren't pointed straight at my throat. "You're keeping me in place to watch the results," I said. "That is one interpretation." He left a stack of new access cards on my desk. "So that's where my part of the story settles. In a room with screens and data, sitting beside something I helped shape. My days now run differently. I wake in a bunk in a quieter wing. I walk to the analysis room. I switch on displays. Live feeds from the fields roll through. Satellite drops arrive on schedule. Software traces paths and paints deviations. I read draft doctrine from commands I'll never visit. My report sits in their footnotes. Some talk about Clark configurations when they refer to a particular ring layout. They don't know those numbers came from a half-shocked officer trying to sabotage his own mission with subtle errors. I flag obvious mistakes. I suggest adjustments that might keep future teams alive without drawing attention to the lies I've already embedded. Those stay in circulation. Sometimes I walk back up to the ridge. The wind hasn't softened. The fences still frame the same white distance. Field Alpha keeps its old rhythm. Men appear, drill, fall, vanish. New layers drift through now and then. Men in gear too modern for the original deployment. But the core remains. Delta carries more weight. You can see several generations there if your eyes are trained. The original battalion still runs its drills. Over that, faint at first and sharpening with each season, move later units. Some wear the crest from my sealed orders, now officially active. They bring larger arrays, more anchors, heavier vehicles. In some cycles I see groups that look like us hauling sleds, ducking invisible fire, taking cover behind objects that resemble our gear. I also see shapes I don't recognize yet. Configurations of equipment that aren't on any parts list. Symbols on harnesses that haven't appeared in any orders. Units moving more like machines than men. All the while I watch for my own outline. It should be simple. I live with my own gait. I know how I hold a clipboard even when it's empty. I know how my shoulders tighten when someone mentions budget limits. I know the gestures I use when I explain routes to drivers. In some runs, I pick out someone on the edge of a convoy, waving a sled into position. In another, a figure trudging uphill from a generator toward an anchor, head bent over a handheld. Somewhere else, a man hovering a little too close to a trench. I never get a view sharp enough to confirm. Maybe that is a kindness. Maybe the pattern works better that way. On my desk, in the analysis room, I keep 2 sheets. One is the folded movement order we took off the early arrival. The other is the final copy of my report. Sometimes I lay them side by side. The order matches reality more each season. Units it names are on the ground now. The crest on its header appears on harnesses in every new run. Its casualty projections line up with internal memorial lists that stay buried behind clearances. The report already feels out of date. New missions stretch beyond its scope. Even so, fresh imagery still shows traces of my edits. Routes bending along gradients I invented, columns spacing themselves out according to my altered distances, men falling in positions that line up with misplotted coordinates more than with the underlying terrain. You ask from behind your wall whether I regret any of this. I could offer you something polished about systems and pressure, and the way institutions teach us to serve stories before facts. I could cast myself as victim or as villain. The narrower truth is that I've always worked like this. On the ice, I picked up that page because I've spent my career picking up forms that other people drop. I signed off on dragging that body into the shelter because Frey watched me like a test, and Bond watched me like a guard, and I broke the rule in the only way that matched my habits. I treated a person like a piece of misfiled paperwork. During extraction, I ordered the rear sled left behind because I couldn't find any move that saved everyone. It was a cold calculation, built from smaller versions I've done in warehouses. Better to lose some stock than the whole line. This time the loss had faces. Back at Southreach, I lied inside the report because that is what I have always done on a smaller scale to keep ledgers balanced and superiors comfortable. This is simply the first time those lies walk across a plateau in formation. So now I watch. That is the punishment you built for me. No exile, no cell, just a front row seat while the thing I helped twist keeps running. Every time a new unit runs across Delta, I check their paths against my file. Every time a doctrinal draft arrives with my phrases in the margins, I mark the parts that will get men killed and wonder what the loop will do with them. You don't need to add charges. The kind of guilt that matters here doesn't need a courtroom. You built Southreach to ring an old disaster. Then you bolted new projects onto it. Now the fence holds everything in place. The lost battalion, the later units, the future missions, the reports, the lies, all of it under a sky that never reacts. I stand at the viewport in the analysis room and watch another cycle at Delta begin. Empty ice, faint trenches. In a breath, men. Old winter kit, new armor, symbols from commands that don't officially exist yet. Arrays in layouts I recognize from draft documents that haven't been signed. Vehicles that look like ours with extra sections welded on. A sled that resembles the one we left, heavier now and busy with hardware. Near the center, a man stumbles off his line, hand out, something folded in his grip. I lean toward the glass. He moves along a path that matches one of the gradients I misreported. He falls where I once wrote the ground as uneven, even though I know from walking it that the surface lies flat. The battalion flows around him. The loops no longer belong solely to those men from the 80s. They carry our footprints and signatures as well. They want to know why the South sits under restrictions. Why maps have blank spaces and satellite feeds blur whole patches of ice. Why men vanish into assignments that never touch their service records. This isn't about hiding one Cold War screw-up. It's about burying an ongoing pattern under ice and stamps, keeping these routes visible only to people who already have skin in them. Anyone who really wants more answers can stand in the suite with me next season. They can trace the lines where my edits live. If they watch long enough, they might find their own outline out there. There's room in the pattern for everyone.